Good morning. My name is Patrick Matgen. I'm at the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, and it's a big pleasure and honor to be able to introduce the Sentinel-1 global flood monitoring system of the Copernicus emergency management service that kept our group busy for the last 3 years, I would say. And I'm actually presenting this on behalf of a large group of people, and you can see the logos of many organizations on top, because it has been a really very large group effort over the last years. And I don't know if Peter agrees, it's a bit of a child also of GFP, I would say, because I mean, earlier discussions about this started, I think, at the GFP meeting in Delft, if I remember correctly, in 2018. So the talk is mostly about one particular aspect of the this GFMS, and that's the ensemble-based approach that we selected to map flood extent globally on a daily basis using Sentinel-1 data. And I'm going to give you a first overview of the evaluation that has been done since the operation started in April this year using 3 independent retrieval algorithms. But before introducing the system, I would like to go back actually to 2018 when these first discussions about this GFMS started. So at that time, some facts there, we had the successful launch of the Sentinel-1 constellation. So there were 2 satellites, AB, that enabled for the first time a systematic high-frequency radar observation at global scale. We could see that in the community, there were more and more processing algorithms presented that had reached a certain technical readiness level. Then there were all these platforms popping up that enabled fast access to imagery, not only Sentinel-1, but other satellite data sources as well. There were also these cloud-based platforms that enabled the fast processing of data. But it was a completely different scene compared to some years ago, when you had lost a lot of time to find the data set, download it, process it locally, distribute the data somewhere. So it was the scene was set for setting up such a global flood monitoring system. And that's how the discussion started with Peter and others to make a feasibility study if it's possible to envisage a real fully automated global Sentinel-1 flood monitoring service. And so we started in 2018 co-designing such a global flood monitoring system together with the large team of the Copernicus EMS. So from the many interactions we had with them, it was clear that at that time, there was no constant automatic monitoring of floods in place. Every time a user had to trigger the system. So when there was a flood happening somewhere in the world, then the people started looking for satellite data, downloading the data, processing it, and distributing it. So often the activation arrived too late. So when the flood already had started having an impact, only then people started processing the data. And of course, that was far from being an efficient way to monitor floods at global scale. So from these meetings, we came to a list of requirements. So we needed to have a timely system, reduce the latency between the data acquisition and the distribution of the maps to the users. We had to make sure that there's a robust, reliable, continuous monitoring of floods. So no longer any activation needed. It's really systematic without any need to trigger an acquisition or processing activity. Of course, the users need high resolution data to also make all the impact assessments that we discussed about this morning. And also one important aspect of the GFMS is that we also distribute freely historic data. So this means that we process the whole archive of Sentinel-1 data since 2014. So there's really these 2 components, the near real-time monitoring plus the distribution of a record of floods observed since 2014. So although I'm going to present mostly the let's say the main data layer of the system, which is the observed water and flood extent, there are many more data layers in the system. So we have the observed water flood extent, but also we use the archive of Sentinel-1 data to generate a reference water mass. And there are 2 types of reference water mass. One is the permanent water body, layer, and the second one are the seasonal or monthly water layers. So they show a certain area of the world, how it is under when it's underwater at a given time of the year. Then we also had to develop an approach to inform on the ensemble uncertainty, so the classification that was obtained, if it is how confident we are about the classification that we achieved. Then there are other information sets like the advisory flags that should inform a user on difficult conditions when the satellite data was acquired, like snow, ice, frost, dry soil, and wind. So even if then the classification is achieved, that the user gets a flag that informs him on the likelihood of a problem of the classification due to these difficult conditions. And then a very important layer, it turned out, is the exclusion layer. So it informs on all areas in the world where currently no classification can be achieved from Sentinel-1. So classification of flood, no flood. So typically these are unfortunately still the urban areas, but not only those, also dense vegetation, radar shadows, permanent low backscatter areas. And as we can see later, this is a rather important part of the world that is currently excluded from the classification that we do. And all these data sets should be available only 12 hours after the data acquisition. So this means that we have two big challenges. So first of all, the retrieval algorithms, they need to be very efficient and robust and achieve high classification accuracies in very diverse landscapes. So that's a big difference to what was done before, because when you have a flood going on, you get the images from that flood and you process these images. That's rather straightforward. But when you have an image where there's no flood and you have to process it as well, there's a high risk of over detection. So that turned out to be the main issue of our team, to find a way to find a good balance between reducing the risk of over detections, but not on the other hand under detecting the floods that are occurring throughout the world. And then challenge 2 was, of course, because of this requirement of having the data ready only 12 hours after the acquisition, we had to make sure to have a very fast access to the imagery and to use high performance computational resources to generate the data sets as fast as possible. So for our group that was was in charge of the algorithm developments, there were different objectives. So first of all, we had to make sure that retrieval algorithms that we developed, they enable the generation of observed flood extent at global scale, and which means, as I just mentioned, that we had to overcome this very important challenge of what we call water lookalikes. So, for example, wet snow is difficult to distinguish from surface water. Also, dry land, dense vegetation can produce very low backscatter, and this can lead to overclassifications or overdetections of flooded areas. And we had to come up with an approach to identify and to exclude these so-called blind spots, so that we can remove these areas from the analysis. And of course, all teams had to work on the efficiency of their workflows. So one important research questions that, together with our colleagues from the TU Vienna and the DLR that were in charge of the algorithm development for the observed water extent, had to address was what is the advantage of using an ensemble-based approach based on 3 independent retrieval algorithms? Does it improve the accuracy and the robustness of the mapping system? So that was the starting point of our work. So all the teams were quite confident about their retrieval algorithms, but what is actually the advantage of combining 3 algorithms in such a system? And also another research question, so what are actually these areas that we have to exclude from the analysis? That was also a research question that we had to address at the beginning of the project. You see here some of the examples of these low backscatter areas that can be mistaken as floods. So, for example, heavy precipitation can have produce low backscatter, And of course, you don't want to classify such a huge area as flooded. That's a big risk that we were facing at the beginning of the project. Or here you see an area in Sweden where at a certain period of the year, when vegetation is growing very fast, then the backscatter drops, and this is a similar effect to the appearance of a flood. So it's another big risk, because you don't want to classify half of Sweden as flooded at some point of the year. So we based our approach on three retrieval algorithms that had previously been presented in the literature. So there's one from the DLR that uses only one Sentinel-1 scene to do the classification of flooded, no flooded areas. Then we have the list algorithm from our team that uses a change detection approach. So it's always a pair of images, and we look at changes of backscatter from the previous acquisition to classify a pixel as flooded or not. And then we have the TU Vienna approach that is doing a time series analysis. So it looks at backscatter recorded over long time periods to see the effect also of vegetation over time, and to see then any anomalies, so a deviation from the normal behavior, to decide if it is flooded or not. So it's a nice set of algorithms, because they are, as I said, they have been intensively discussed in the literature before, but they are also very different. I mean, having just one image, two images, or a full time series, that's of course the completely different approach to the same problem. The ensemble approach that we then adopted is rather straightforward. So by default, or in the normal scenario, the three algorithms produce a flood map, and we apply what we call a consensus decision. So we classify a pixel as flooded if two or three algorithms come to that conclusion. It becomes a bit more tricky when one of the three algorithms doesn't produce a result, and you have then a split decision. And the decision that is currently implemented is that in that case, we look at the uncertainties of the two remaining algorithms, and the algorithm that has the lowest uncertainty is the one that then prevails. So we see here an example of how that works. So you have here a flood that occurred in China last year, where you see in red the areas where you have two or more algorithms agreeing on the flooding status of the area. So this summarizes also how this product is then combined with the other products that I briefly mentioned. So you have the flood extent map on top on the left. You have the permanent water bodies map. You have the seasonal water body map from the season or from the months in which the acquisition took place. And you have this exclusion layer, which is combined of different combination of different layers. So radar shadows, urban areas, and dry areas, and you combine all this into one map that gives you then the water extent, the seasonal water bodies, and excluded areas. And this is how it looks like in the end when it's now it's working operationally since April this year. So this is a snapshot from a few days ago, on the 3rd of September. You see the extent of the flood in Pakistan that was recorded by Sentinel-1. And I invite you all to come this afternoon to the marketplace, where we have a live demo, not just of this water extent layer, but also you can see how we can use the other layers and go back to find some flood maps from other regions in the world that were monitored since October last year. So now about the main part of this talk was the evaluation, and it's relatively challenging to do an evaluation of such a system at global scale. So actually we did a three-step evaluation. The first one, I would say, was the straightforward one. So looking at the performance of the algorithms to monitor major floods in the world. There, the tricky part is to find independent reference data sets like those that you see here on the screen, where you have big flood events in Greece, US, and Myanmar that were recorded by, I think, in all three cases, Sentinel-2. So we could do a visual interpretation of these images and produce the reference layers that you can see here on the right. And we could compute then different performance metrics for the individual algorithms and the ensemble to see the performance of the system. Then the second approach that I will show just after that is how to evaluate then the risk of over detections. I will show this just in a minute. So here you see the results of the when the three algorithms and the ensemble are compared against the reference maps from Sentinel-2. This was not really a surprise. I mean, all the algorithms individually had been compared against many floods in the world over the last years. So we were quite confident that each algorithm is able to reach a rather high performance measure. In this case, it's the CSI score that should be close to 0.8 or above. But what was the very nice result for the team was when we then did the same analysis with the ensemble, we could see that in two cases, the ensemble had even a higher accuracy than the individual algorithms. And only in one case, the result was slightly below the best performing algorithms performance. But again, this was not really that surprising. The real challenge, as I said before, was to see what happens when you run such a workflow systematically at global scale in areas where there's no floods. How often does it happen that you have these over detections? So here we used three representative areas in the world. One was in US, Canada, where we knew that there was a lot of snow that could be misclassified as flooded at certain times of the year. A second site was in Somalia, where we have very dry areas producing low backscatter, and again there was a big risk of over detections. And then the third one was in Sweden, where at least in May, June, vegetation is growing very fast, and we also knew that there could be a big risk of over detection. So here in Canada, we had again a Sentinel-2 scene that we could use as a reference at some point of the year. So we used the Sentinel-1 derived flood maps to compute different or to make a visual comparison between what we see in the Sentinel-2 scene and what we could derive from Sentinel-1. And here in particular, you see that snow did not seem to be a major issue, mostly, of course, also because of the exclusion area that is applied. So in the when you are reach a certain height above the drainage, then these areas anyway excluded. So it's only the floodplain that is really the focus of our workflow. And in that case, we could see that we were able to map the flooded areas, but we did not have any major over detections. But you can also see that the results of the three algorithms differ quite significantly. And in particular, there was one algorithm that was under detecting this event quite substantially. But then the good thing is that the ensemble approach increases the robustness of the whole system. And in the end, the ensemble was the one that was the closest to what we could visually see in the scene. The second example from Somalia. Here again, there's one cloud-free image that was acquired at some time of the year. So we see that there was one algorithm that was classifying a large fraction of that area as flooded, while by the analysis of the Sentinel-2 scene, there was no evidence of any flooding going on there. So that's a major over detection. But again, there were two algorithms that did not have this issue, and the ensemble could then mitigate the problem as it was expected to do. Then so we had not so many cloud-free scenes available that we could use as a reference, but we wanted also to know what happens if we run our process over a period of 7 months. And we counted the number of times that certain areas were classified as flooded. And the same algorithm that already produced the over detection that I showed on the previous slide, over a period of 7 months, you can see that it happens quite frequently that this algorithm produces flood extents in areas where there was no flood at all. Also, the other algorithms, if you look closely, they at times produced also some over detections due to the very dry soils in that area. And in this case, actually, the ensemble was not the best performing algorithm, because you can see it can only partially mitigate the problem caused by one algorithm. But still, the result is quite satisfying. So another important issue that we were facing are vegetated areas. So here you see the example of Sweden, where in May, June, you have this fast-growing vegetation that causes low backscatter. And the algorithm on top, algorithm 1, that's the one from DLR, where you only have only one image that is taken into account. In this case, it also caused some severe over detections in one part of the area, but you don't have the same effect with the other two algorithms. And again, the ensemble is in the end mitigating the issue. So again, as before, we also here ran the workflow over a period of 6 months from January to July 2019. And you can see that this problem is still present. So when you produce flood areas or flood maps in this area over such a long period, there are unfortunately several regions in Sweden that are misclassified as flooded several times a year. And also the ensemble could not fully address the issue. So this remains still I would say the major issue to solve in the next months, is that how to reduce the number of over detections caused by fast growing vegetation. And this is not only a problem in Sweden, but also in other areas of the world. And it's not something that can be easily excluded, because often these vegetated areas are in the low-lying floodplains. So there's not any information available that allows you to mask them out easily. So although we are very happy about the first results, I mean, it's just the beginning. And I think it's also very interesting to address this community, because GFM is obviously not the end of the story. So we are having now a nice product, but we would like to also emphasize that there's still a need to do more on-demand processing or analysis of satellite data when floods happen, like now in Pakistan. So you can use the output of GFM that is here presented on the left, and you can then use more detailed analysis that at the moment are not done at the global scale. Like in this case, for example, a map obtained by combining the psi intensity with topography data to convert the extent map into water depths. Of course, there's also a need to use other data sources, not just Sentinel-1, so data sources that might not be available systematically, but only acquisitions take place in case of a flood. So these informations, of course, should be taken into account as well. Then I have another example of such a value-adding activity. So again, using as the input data set the water extent map produced for Pakistan last week, where we could see that many settlements were surrounded by water, but since all the urban areas were included in the exclusion layer, we didn't know exactly from this result what are now the settlements or the built areas that are affected by the flood. So we selected different areas spread across the floodplain, like the cities of Pamba, Patodero, and the third one, which is Darkana, where we then use again this more advanced analysis of the short look complex images from Sentinel-1 that are currently not processed by default by GFM, to see if we can see the effect of flooding in urban areas. So you see here for the 3 cases, the urban areas are indicated in these very bright pixels. So these are areas that normally have a consistent backscatter behavior over time. So it's very rare that you see a drop of the coherence of the satellite signature in these areas, and very often if this happens, it's a sign that the flood water was appearing in the urban areas. So for these 3 cases, we complemented the water extent map obtained by GFM, indicated in light blue, with some dark blue pixels that you can see in the urban settlement. So this combination of these 2 layers then shows the full extent of flooding. And in fact, the blue areas or dark blue areas are the areas that are maybe of highest interest, because there's a high likelihood that communities are directly affected by this flood water. So just some general conclusions. So in terms of accuracy for specific events and specific areas of interest, it's still a reality that individual approaches outperform the ensemble-based approach that is now implemented in GFM. However, overall, from what we can see after 6 months of operations, is that the ensemble approach improves the robustness of the whole system. And also the accuracy that we achieve is at the level of the one that is achieved by the individual algorithms. And of course, and we could see that also these large flooding events, they are mapped with satisfying accuracy. The main issue remains the need to control the number of over-detections, and as I said, to find a good balance between the risk of over-detections and the risk of not correctly detecting the floods that happen in the world. So in particular, the issue related to fast-growing vegetation is still very much present, and we need to find a way to reduce the over-detections caused by this phenomenon. So there are many different ways to improve these products, of course. So one important task is to improve the overall accuracy and the reliability of the service. For example, to have approaches that are adaptive to vegetation and crop changes, or to find different ways to compute the ensemble. So that's something we are currently working on. Then it's also a reality at the moment that the area covered by the excluded areas is still very big. So of course, urban areas, permanent low backscatter areas, very dry areas, if you sum this up, it's a very big part of the globe that is currently excluded from our analysis. So we have, of course, also the ambition to find ways to reduce the number of excluded areas, for example, by the approach that I just showed you, where you can do some advanced analysis of SAR data in urban areas, so that you can also inform on the flood present in such areas. And I think, and that's a third topic that I think there's no better community than this one to discuss this. So also to find ways to develop value-adding activities, for example, to make use of this data set, especially the full archive when it will be available, to maybe compare the results with flood inundation models, to use the data to improve the calibration of such models, or to control these models through data assimilation approaches. And maybe when the archive is available, also to have a better understanding of global scale flood hazard and risk. I mean, there are many teams here in the room that have already worked on that topic. And so to combine different data sets will surely improve our understanding of global flood risk and hazard. So here are the most important, maybe the most important slide with the links where you can start using or find the data and start using it. And we are, of course, very much looking forward to your feedback to continue to improve the system and to find ways to make this data set as useful as possible for many different communities. And then, as I said before, there's another opportunity to discuss this in more detail in the marketplace this afternoon. That's all from me. Thanks a lot.
I don't have any questions. Thanks for the presentation. How would you explain the reason that ensemble approach outperform individual algorithms overall? What would you think would be the reason for that?
I think that every algorithm has its strengths and weaknesses, and by combining the output in an intelligent way, then of course the goal is to reduce the individual weaknesses and to emphasize the strengths. That's what we were hoping for, and our first results seem to confirm this. But I think the main advantage at the moment is simply to increase the robustness of the system. Nobody, not the DLR, not us, not the TUViena had ever before applied the algorithm at global scale. So it was a bit a very challenging or even frightening task in the beginning to start applying this globally. And of course, when we saw the first results coming in of Sweden being flooded for 2 months every year, that was really for us an enriching experience then to exchange between the different algorithm teams. Some teams said we cannot address this problem, but in that case maybe your algorithm can take over in some sense. And in the end, that was the most interesting part of this project, to find ways to take advantage of each algorithm's strengths and to reduce the weaknesses.
You think ensemble will combine the strengths of each algorithm together?
Yes.
Patrick, thank you for your presentation. When I look at the example you presented on Sweden about the dry vegetation reporting as flooding, or the continuous crop growing period where you reported as flooding.
Yeah.
So the definition of flood from the mapping perspective also need to be clear. There are some good floods and there are bad floods, right? So if you look at in many of the developing regions in monsoon season,
yeah,
the flood is beneficial for farmers. 5 days of a flood is not called a disaster.
yeah,
So when you give a one-dimensional map and then as the season is coming, the flood you may report and later it disappears. So you may need to relate temporary flood or a seasonal flooding rather than defining everything as a flood. So is that anything your algorithm, because we developed something like that in many parts of the world where insurance companies will show overestimation of a flooding will also lead to a bad insurance product. So this is something which can be looked at. And the second point is that, you know, within the GFP community, there are a lot of algorithms have been developed by various institutions. So it might be good to pick up 1 or 2 flood events and evaluate the ensemble approach, but also bringing more than the 3 algorithms to really see how it is working and what are the beneficial. It can be a good publications or a report we could bring to the flood communities. Those are 2 observations.
For the first point, we have this seasonal water body product that complements the water extent product. So for this we use Sentinel-1 data acquired over a period of 2 years. And this helps us to find out if a certain area is systematically flooded at a given time of the year, maybe because of irrigation, so that a user sees this is an area that is every time flooded at that time of the year. So that's not a disaster. It's something that happens there every year. So, I mean, it's not a perfect approach. We can, of course, not make this distinction that you said between how you said bad flood or good flood. We are just looking for surface water. I mean, that the impact, that's still another story. But I think that to have this additional products, seasonal water bodies and permanent water bodies, that contextualizes a bit the information we get from a single image and helps the users. For the second point, yes, I'm very much looking forward to these types of collaborations. I mean, the data is freely available. All the algorithms have been presented in the literature, and here the 2 documents that I invite you to have a look at that explain in detail the approaches that have been selected. And we are, I think I can say this on behalf of the whole consortium, very interested in comparing these results to other approaches.